All right, this is lecture number 4 for the Great Depression, and we're talking about the Second New Deal today. Yesterday we talked about how FDR really tried to improve the lives of people and kind of their situations during the Great Depression, but a lot of the things that he was doing were found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Kind of FDR was kind of expanding his power beyond what it should have been. So he needed to create some new programs that were more constitutional, and also some programs that really helped to stimulate the economy. So today we're going to focus on the Second New Deal. He's obviously reelected, and the reason he's reelected is because he has shown to get people jobs and shown that he cares and shown that he's going to do something about it. So people are really starting to like him. The Second New Deal focuses more on living conditions of the people, and one big aspect of Franklin Roosevelt that people don't really know too much about or don't really think much about it is his wife. His wife Eleanor Roosevelt is probably the most famous first lady ever. And what she did is she would go out and visit the towns and visit the cities and see really what's going on, and she would report back to her husband. And she had a lot of influence on her husband and really wanted to help the poor and the suffering. One of the reasons why she was so necessary was because FDR was actually in a wheelchair and he had polio, but people didn't know about it, and it was kind of something that was kept under wraps because they wanted people to think that the president was weak. So she did a lot of the traveling for him so that she could be the face of what was going on and not someone that was stuck in a wheelchair and kind of could be perceived as weak during a time when we really would need someone so powerful and strong. All right, so the first thing we're going to talk about is helping farmers. We know that farms are closing, that people couldn't produce enough crops and enough goods to make enough money to keep their farms open, so they would close. So every 5 farms were mortgaged, and thousands of small farmers lost their farms. So we know that the Agricultural Adjustment Act was struck down, so we need a way to try to recreate that. So we create the Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment Act. And this replaces the AAA, and it paid for farmers to cut production of soil depleting crops. We don't want to have another Dust Bowl, so we want to keep that soil rich and fruitful. 2 years later, Congress passes the second Agricultural Adjustment Act, and it doesn't include a processing tax to pay for subsidies that caused the first Agricultural Adjustment Act to be unconstitutional. So it's basically reinstating it without that tax, which makes it constitutional now. Okay, we're going to extend relief by creating jobs. So there's a series of programs that's set to help the youth, the professionals, and other workers. Okay, the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was probably his most influential program, and it's set to create as many jobs as possible as quickly as possible. So 8 million Americans now have jobs, and they're doing things like building airports, roads, and other public buildings. You can actually go online and look up the WPA and see what buildings in your cities were created by the WPA. Women worked in sewing groups. They employed writers and artists and gave people opportunities to work and earn a paycheck, which gives them dignity. A lot of the problems during the Great Depression came from the loss of worth. People work for a living, and people, America was created out of hard work, and now all these people, a quarter of the population are unemployed, and it really takes brings down your morale. People feel like they're kind of worthless. What are they doing in life? What do they have going on for them? So even if they're not getting paid that much, the fact that they're working kind of drives them to continue and keep fighting. And if people just continually don't work, they kind of just give up, and they kind of feel like their lives are worthless. Another program is the National Youth Administration, and it's created specifically to create jobs to the youth, and it gave aids to students in exchange for work. If students were trying to study and get a job or get a degree or diploma and they didn't have money to pay for it, if they worked for the youth administration, they would be given money to, given aid for their school loans and stuff. All right, and then improving labor and other reforms. Okay, we have the National Labor Relations Board, which is still in existence today, the NLRB. It was nicknamed the Wagner Act, also known as the Wagner Act, and has reestablished the NIRA portion of collective bargaining. Okay, so the NIRA was struck down as unconstitutional, and this reinstated that, and it allowed the federal government to protect the rights of workers to join unions. Okay, so unionization was kind of thought of as a bad thing during the Depression because everyone is out of work, or not everyone, but there's such large numbers of people that are out of work that it didn't seem fair to be asking for higher wages when people were all losing their jobs. But this is, created the ability, or continued the ability for people to be in labor unions and to work together to get what they needed. The Social Security Act, it's still in existence today. Every one of you has a Social Security card, a Social Security number that you probably have memorized or should have memorized by the time you start working and renting and buying things. But what Social Security does is it gives old age insurance for retirees over 65. So 65 now becomes the retirement point for our society. And you make money, or you're given money by the government once you retire. And this is not a complete handout because you pay into this. So this is not necessarily a free lunch sort of thing. Every time you look at your paycheck, if you guys work, you look at your paycheck, you'll see there's money coming out for Social Security and you're paying into the system. So what you do is you pay into the system for 50 years or so, and when you retire, that money comes back to you. It's kind of like a savings account, kind of like your own 401k, but it's paid by the government. Problem with this is at this point we have more, or like the baby boomers are retiring, so we're going to have more people on Social Security than are paying into it, so it may not be able to sustain itself. Also, we had a surplus in Social Security back in the early millennium, and we started to take money out of this to fund wars and to fund other safety net programs because we thought we had extra money, and that kind of dried up the Social Security's fund. So that's a reason why if you ever hear politics talking or people talking about politics that Social Security is unsustainable, a lot of it is because we borrowed against our own, quote unquote 401ks that we have saving for ourselves. And you should never ever borrow against your 401k because you're going to need it later in life. Okay. Also with Social Security, half of the funds come from you, half come from your employer. So the employers do have to pay into Social Security. We also now have unemployment compensation, so if you don't have a job, you get paid money until you find a job. And I talked about in class how it's 99 weeks at this point, which is almost 2 years. And then they gave aid to families with dependent children and the disabled, so kind of helping those that are in need, that are incapable of working as well. Okay, and that's it.